Hey, I'm Sass, and I'm running for U.S. House of Representatives down here in Austin, Texas, and this is my Justice Gauntlet. One of the problems of the first two Reconstructions is how they ended. The first one was pretty abruptly, the second one kind of faded out, and some stuff got flipped on its head. For example, the war on poverty became the war on drugs. So an incredibly important part of a third Reconstruction, which we desperately need in the U.S. right now, is the sustainability of it and ensuring that it sticks around. And this is actually a lot of what my core platform is about, fixing the mechanics and the incentives to realign the interests of our government with the interests of the people, so we can ensure that government action is sustainable and that it does stay within line. Third Reconstruction looks like a lot of things. So whether it's, I of course for universal basic income, which will disproportionately help impoverished communities, which of course are disproportionately Black and brown. But we're also looking at explicitly addressing the racial disparities in healthcare. It's not just universal healthcare. We need to address the racial biases that underlie that. We need to look at. We need to make sure that it's a ground up change. So we need to make sure we put power into the hands of Black and brown folks to rebuild their own communities and just provide tools and resources rather than trying to have this white savior-esque elite solutions, which we just so often have in America. Another platform pillar I have is directly addressing division. This is a really important part of addressing a lot of the political divide and people not listening to each other is an incredibly important piece of, if we don't address that, we're never going to be able to reconcile with our real history and actually come to understand what the U.S., the path of the U.S. has been and how it has affected people. So that then we're talking about education and what we're learning in classrooms, right? So we need to have a huge divestment of federal funds into public education with a specific focus on low-income communities, again, disproportionately Black and brown, and ensuring that those funds stay in classrooms. So teacher salaries, teacher budgets, student equipment, reducing class sizes, and then as well as just a decentralization of curriculum to give students and teachers more power over what they learn. The list goes on and on and on. There's so many different creative ideas. I don't think I should be the sole person dictating what that is. We need to bring the people who are being affected by all of the problems of our racist history into the conversation and empower them to really write the solutions. And I just want to leverage my power to amplify Black voices. So everything I've just talked about is going to be our themes that you're going to be hearing about throughout this Justice Gauntlet. My stance on gun reform is broken down into two things: simple, short-term changes to quickly reduce gun deaths, and then a sustainable long-term solution to address guns. So the immediate problem is we have around 40,000 gun deaths per year in the US. More than half of those are suicides. The reasons for those suicides are economic disparity, culture, lack of mental health treatment, trauma, especially for veterans, temporary crisis, etc. It's not guns. But the problem is that addressing all of those causes, the root disease, is going to take a huge amount of money, people, energy, and most importantly, time. In that time, we're going to continue to lose tens of thousands of lives. Unfortunately, death is a symptom we cannot recover from. So while we're working on the time-consuming cures for the diseases, which is a whole mess and a different web of problem that cause the gun deaths, quick, easy, simple reforms like free or subsidized gun storage locks, universal waiting periods, instituting a perpetual optional gun buyback program, and adjusting key laws to put the onus of safety on gun owners. can act as first aid measures to take that 40,000 number down to 30,000 or 20,000, 10 or 5. These reforms are intended as symptom treatment, not as cures for the disease. To talk a little bit more about suicide, an important thing that I want to point out with suicide is that suicide with a gun is far more lethal than suicide with other methods because of its inherent high deadliness, the ease of use, and inability to abort mid-attempt. And that matters because when people survive a suicide attempt, over 90% of the time, they don't end up dying from suicide later on. If we can remove the gun from the suicide equation for an individual, we can dramatically increase the chance that person is going to survive their suicide attempt and go on to live a fuller, longer, happier life. Again, this is a reduction. It's not going to get us from 40,000 to 0. It's to save a few lives right now. The bulk of remaining gun deaths in the US are homicides, but mostly not from mass shootings, despite their increasing frequency. Similar to suicides, access to guns is the most controllable factor in reducing gun deaths. Many shooters have actually openly admitted that if firearms weren't easily available to them, the shooting wouldn't have happened. And yes, I'm specifically referring to shooters who weren't supposed to have access to guns in the first place. So requiring gun owners to keep their firearms securely locked when not being used or on their person can sometimes be enough of a barrier to prevent the wrong people from obtaining them in the first place. I mean, you'd be surprised how many people don't take a drink just because there's a lock on their liquor cabinet. And so the federal government can provide rebates for home and vehicle locking systems to gun owners as an incentive to buy and use them. Universal waiting periods can prevent people from acting irrationally on their anger or sadness. I am in favor of universal background checks to close the private gun sale loophole, but I do want to recognize that there are many issues, including just inherent racism in the system with the National Instant Criminal Background Check System. There are a lot of reforms that can happen there, and I'm interested in discussing this, but I'm focused on these simple reforms. A perpetual optional gun buyback program gives gun owners an easy option to discard their firearms without having to worry about them ending up in the wrong hands. And there are several laws that incentivize gun owners to use their firearms to kill rather than deter. For example, in many states, warning shots and brandishing without firing are illegal or have little or senseless guidance as to when and how to do so to deter a threat. Additionally, there are a few legal protections for people who fire non-lethal shots. This often leads to survivors of shootings successfully suing the shooter for damages, regardless of what actually happened. I mean, if somebody broke into your home and you shoot them and they don't die, and then they can sue you for damages, I mean, that's a little bit nonsense. And so this incentivizes gun owners to shoot to kill rather than deter. So just making small tweaks to these laws can shift the onus on gun owners from violence to safety. But I want to get to the more long-term sustainable solution because I think that this is really where we get to the coalition building part of it. So at a high level, I want to empower the gun community to regulate itself. Mechanically, this would work by empowering local militias to write regulations and rules regarding obtaining, transporting, accessorizing, storing, using, and selling firearms and ammo in their jurisdiction. The size of militias can vary, but approximately county size. In urban areas, maybe you'd have several that are separate but work together. In rural areas, maybe tri-county, we would have federal guidelines in place to cover the gaps, such as when people are moving or in communities that choose not to have a militia. The nature of these guidelines is up for further national discussion with gun owners, and it's really important that we bring them in. And some of them could even be intentionally designed to be overwritten by local militias. Those local militias would be required to make the regulations accessible through hotlines and public websites supported by and linked through a centralized government website, so gun owners can always have up-to-date information on local regulations, both where they live and where they're traveling. But here's a really important, a really crucial aspect of it is that these local militias would be held accountable for gun deaths in their jurisdictions or in others from where their the gun originated in theirs, by the Department of Justice at the federal level, and then whatever means are deemed fit by the communities they're in, because that's exactly where guns are an issue. Communities. If you shoot a gun in El Paso, it doesn't kill someone in Houston. We know that more guns in urban areas leads to more gun deaths, but it doesn't necessarily play out the same in rural areas. One size fits all solutions for guns is not sustainable in a country as large and diverse as the US. Right now, gun owners of all kinds don't have much voice in the rules around their gun. By moving regulations down to the community level, gun owners' voices are amplified immensely, especially the many gun owners who advocate for more gun safety. The other advantage I really like about this is its compatibility with the language of the Second Amendment. If you're maybe not a fan of some of those short-term reforms I was talking about earlier, this should seem like a workable approach. There's a lot more that needs to happen in this conversation, and more people need to come in. It needs to spread. It's quite comprehensive, and we need diverse input and consideration. I'm super excited about a conversation around this idea, and I'd love to hear from more folks on how to do this, because I really think that this is a workable path forward to really be inclusive of all the different types of people in America without infringing on people's rights. Queer rights, queer protections, equality for queer folks. There are a variety of things that need to happen around these issues. Personally, I believe that the Equal Protections Clause, right, Section 1 of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, already covers all of this. But the problem is that we can see that that's not enough, that neutral policy isn't enough, and that in order to address these issues, we need active policy. And the really cool part is Congress is empowered by the Equal Protections Clause to put active policy in place, because a lot of states still have actively anti-queer legislation. The legality of being able to fire somebody for being queer, or looking at education and curriculum, state curriculums that explicitly disallow talking about queer identities. Like, that's something we're seeing happen here in Texas, which is just absurd. We need to put active legislation in place for these protections. But it goes so much further than that. On the topic of education, I don't believe that education should end at 18 or 22 or 25. Education should be a lifelong journey. There's a lot that needs to be done in that space of education reform. We need to ensure that all of the adults who missed some very necessary education when they were in primary school can get the education that they need now. And that includes about the evolving language and better understanding of human identity. We just have way more understanding of human identity now than we did 20 years ago. But a lot of people are missing out on that. And part of the reason that people are missing out on that is because people are tolerant of what they experience every day. And there are a lot of folks who just haven't experienced, haven't had a lot of experience around queer folks. Now, I can't force people to go spend time with people they don't want to spend time with. But I do find value in diversity for the sake of diversity, so long as there are not other incentives in the way that wash it out. As an example, if you were to just add women to a board of directors at a corporation, well, the profit motive, the profit incentive of that destroys all of that. But so long as you don't have those things in the way, there is value in diversity. And I think it is our greatest strength as a country, and that division is our greatest weakness. There are other things we can do. We could have a program for youth and young adults, or adults of any age, to do 2 years paid of domestic civil service, where we'll send you somewhere in the country and you can work with maybe a local Indian tribe on land restoration, or you can just do some kind of community aid work. It's not just overseas in Africa. I mean, like, we have schools that need to be built here. We can build into that program diversity aspect of it. And again, it's about allowing people to experience that diversity firsthand every day, because that's how we build that tolerance and that understanding. And it's part of how we move forward. So there's no single thing that needs to be done. Starting with active legislation at the federal level to explicitly protect queer folks is a great start. It ties in with other things I've talked about, like universal basic income and stuff. But there are a variety of things that we can do to help expose each other to the reality of the diversity of human identity, which I believe will lead to more tolerance and more kindness in America. And that's really what it comes down to. There's this line that people say: there are 500,000 homeless folks in the US, but 17 million vacant houses. There is validity to that sentiment of we could do it if we just decided to do it. And I agree with that. But I also want to look at things realistically about all the barriers and the government that's in the way, as well as the trust that's been lost in institutions by folks who are homeless. If you've ever spent time on the ground or talked to people who have spent a lot of time on the ground working with unhoused neighbors, homeless folks, you'll understand that it's not as simple as that. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done. Here's the thing. If you Google how to solve homelessness, you will end up on the solutions page of the website for the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness. And they've got 2 sentences. It says, "We know what it takes to end homelessness. The solutions are highlighted below." And there are 8 things. Some of those things are much more on municipalities or localities to deal with, but some of it is also at the federal level. The 2 biggest things that we can do at the federal level to give municipalities a fighting chance at addressing homelessness are universal basic income and universal health care. If somebody who's homeless, when someone who's homeless walks into a social services center, the first thing they do is try to help them figure out what programs they can qualify for. Well, if we have an unconditional basic income, boom, we can write them a check for $500 or $1,000 or $2,000 right there on the spot. It gives them an immediate opportunity to make positive, constructive decisions and choices. And we can also build into that same program additional provisions for training more social workers, just to be a helping hand. Because if you haven't had more than $50 to your name in the last decade, getting a check for $1,000 is maybe a little bit overwhelming. Still their money to spend, but maybe some guidance would be helpful. And then, of course, universal health care. I mean, when you're unhealthy, when you can't get the health care that you need, it's difficult to do anything. As well as, just looking at this combination of, like I said, basic income and healthcare, 80 to 90% of health outcomes are determined by socioeconomic and environmental factors. So we really do need both of these things. But if the federal government can handle those 2 big things, and then work with municipalities on jumpstarting, better public health programs, or building more housing, or whatever other things it may be, addressing drug issues, war on drugs. I mean, there are a variety of different things here, but there are some smaller things. But I always come at this from the perspective of Congress, because that's where I'm going. And so universal basic income, universal health care are the 2 biggest things we need to do at the federal level to work toward a place where housing is a human right in this country. I do believe in reparations for American descendants of slavery after universal basic income. Universal basic income will disproportionately help those who are impoverished and economically disadvantaged, which of course are disproportionately Black and brown folks, as well as Indians. There's a moral argument. I'm not the best at making it, to be honest, but I have gone over it and it does settle and make sense with me. A lot of it is understanding our real history and how that affects people today. But I like to say reparations after unconditional basic income, because you do need to start with this, just getting everybody out of scarcity mentality first and foremost before we can move anything forward. But this also provides a path and a way to get money to people in a secure fashion. Now, should reparations come in the form of money or a combination of things or no money at all? I don't think that's up to me to decide. I don't want to be some white savior. I believe that I should leverage my power to amplify, again, Black voices and to gather a group of American descendants of slavery. And fortunately, there are organizations for this that already exist, and say, you decide who should get what and in what form should it come, and write a blank check and say whatever you feel is right, and show us that it makes sense. Cool, let's do it. I'm down. I don't believe that I should be making those decisions. And again, I have a mechanism built into my universal basic income plan to get money to people in a secure way, so the courts can't touch it, and so that creditors, loan sharks can't get after it. It doesn't go to child support. It goes to people. And so this is kind of my stance is, yes, I'm for reparations, and I want to empower a group of, I want to empower American descendants of slavery to actually write the details of that plan, because I don't believe that that should be coming from me. There are a lot of issues with police brutality right now, and there's no one thing that's going to solve it. It's 1,000 little things. I think the simplest first thing that we can do at the federal level, because again, I'm going to be in Congress, is to fund the Department of Justice. This is an administration that already exists to hold police departments accountable, and they are currently under-resourced and can't do so. But it extends from there. Of course, there are a variety of things that municipalities need to be doing, moving funds from the parts of police that don't work into programs that do. So, public health, education, housing. But sometimes those programs can be difficult to start up. And I believe this is where the federal government can step in and provide funding to start up emergency social service programs, or again, helping with public health and housing and education. There are other things we do at the federal level. We can end qualified immunity at the federal level. We can provide incentives for police to get additional training. So, for example, we could have anti-discrimination training and de-escalation training, and turn them into certifications and say, okay, if as a police officer you go through this training and you get this certification, then the federal government will tack an extra $100 on every one of your paychecks, or something like that, whatever. I can negotiate the number. And this provides an incentive for police to actually go through that additional training. There's another problem at play too as well, which is mental health. And this doesn't just affect police. This also affects medical professionals. It affects soldiers, where if a police officer experiences something traumatic, same thing with all these other professions too, and they say, well, I need some help dealing with this thing I just experienced. Well, they can lose hours, they can get pay cuts, they can get demoted, they can even lose their job. And so at the federal level, I believe we should have a blanket law across the country, public sector and private sector. If you experience a traumatic event and ask for help, then you are not whoever your employer is not allowed to cut your pay or take your hours or fire you or demote you, unless of course you want that in that time, but they can't force that on you. And to give protections to people who have experienced those things, because what happens with, let's focus on police specifically. You experience something traumatic, you can't get the help from it. Well, natural human defenses kick in. And the main one we see with police is compartmentalization. And what that does is it makes it easier to commit violent acts, because you clock in and then all of a sudden you're a different person. It's a different world, and it doesn't touch your personal life. Whatever you do, that's all going to be compartmentalized away. And then you clock out and you're back to your personal life. You don't have to deal with that anymore. Of course, it's really toxic. Of course, that's going to be harmful, and that trickles into communities. Another thing at the federal level too is, looking at, when I mentioned soldiers, well, a lot of police officers are former military. They are employing military tactics on civilians, which is not appropriate. And so if we had a reverse boot camp for soldiers as they exit the military to help them reacclimate to civilian life, that could also help to address some of these issues with police brutality, as well as the continuous chain of military equipment that is flowing from the military into the police precincts. Police departments don't need tanks. They just don't. So we can cut that off completely or dramatically reduce it, I think would be helpful. There are a variety of other things that I think should be done at municipal levels. I would love to see a municipality just trial something like, police have to keep their gun on the car. They don't have the holster on their person. And so if they need the gun, it needs to be an intentional choice that they're gonna bring it with them. And just see if that helps. I don't know if it would, but there are creative ideas out there that we can try to address some of these issues, or crisis intervention training, or whatever it may be. But at the federal level, those are some of the big ideas that I have around police reform. But I also want to clearly state that it doesn't end there, and there's absolutely room for more conversation and more that we can do in this space. There are a lot of people fighting on the front lines directly against domestic terrorism, and I welcome that fight, and I support the folks who are doing it. But I feel that while that fight is important and there are a lot of people doing it, there are very few people that are addressing the root causes at the same time. How did we end up in a place where we have increasing domestic terrorism? Well, there are a couple reasons. Economic disparity. When people are in survival mode and they're subject to scarcity mentality, their minds become much more vulnerable to dangerous rhetoric. A universal basic income will help pull people out of poverty, out of that scarcity mentality, and make them mentally stronger against those kinds of rhetoric. Culture is a big piece of it. We see that the vast majority of domestic terrorism is from men and young men and boys, actually. And oftentimes we see that they have felt isolated from the world, that people didn't want to sit down and listen to their concerns, that there was this kind of cancel culture that maybe got to them in some way. And so then they turned to these dangerous platforms that then led to this spiral down. And that's more of an underpinning or just a piece or a part of the general division and polarity that we're experiencing in the United States right now. Directly addressing division is another pillar of my platform. And there are a variety of things I want to do in that space, including the separation of news and opinion and categorizing them very cleanly, and applying fairness doctrine to political commentary. So there needs to be an equal amount of time given to opposing viewpoints on any show, as well as working to decouple press from the profit motive through things like journalism vouchers, where Americans get a certain number of dollars, maybe $120 a year, that they can only spend on subscription journalism, or just low conditionality funding for local investigative and independent journalism, as well as maybe having matching funds for municipalities for local journalism, so people have more places to decentralize sources and narratives, so people have more places to go to learn about their communities. We're also looking at education as well. Ensuring, COVID has only exacerbated the problem. We have to protect our children, but having those social spheres is incredibly important for development, ensuring that kids get to spend time together and get that social bit. Comprehensive parenting education for teens and for adults. We need to have this available. Again, this comes back to what I was talking about earlier about education doesn't end at 18 or 22 or 25. And it's finding ways to bring that education to people. We need to meet people where they are. That's I think is probably the biggest thing. And we talk about the root causes of domestic terrorism is we're not meeting everybody where they are. Yes, of course, there are things like looking at the real racist past of America and so many of these other things. In that same kind of realm that we can attack as well. But I want to recognize the real bits here of what do we need to do to actually prevent domestic terrorism, and it comes from addressing this division and this disparity that people are feeling. Also voting method reform, which I will talk about more with democracy. Our current choose one voting method mechanically polarizes our politics and by proxy our people. But if we had a more consensus-based voting method like approval voting or star voting, it could help bring us together. So these are some of the core things that we need to address. Again, as I said with gun reform, addressing these root causes is going to take time. This doesn't happen overnight. So I do still welcome the frontline fight against domestic terrorism, but at the same time, we also need to be addressing some of these underlying causes that I think a lot of people have been almost afraid to talk about. But if we don't, then this is going to be a problem forever.